Forensics begins where emotion leaves off. The same tears that move an audience can mislead an investigation if they're untested, unframed, unverified. When grief becomes performance, the challenge for investigators is no longer what's felt, but what can be measured. In this next section, we examine how public displays and private defenses reshape the forensic landscape, how sympathy blurred objectivity, how culture sanctified performance, and how a tragedy of emotion transformed into a crisis of evidence. Because in the Ramsey case, the question is no longer did they grieve, it's what did that grief accomplish. From a forensic criminology perspective, the pattern of public emotional display combined with private investigative guardedness creates significant challenges for case assessment. Forensically, investigators need to evaluate both what people say and how they say it, the emotional congruence between content and delivery, the spontaneity of responses, the physiological markers of genuine versus performed emotion. When suspects control the context of emotional display, choosing to be emotionally available in unstructured media settings while remaining defended in formal interviews, it degrades the forensic value of emotional assessment. The CNN interview, while emotionally powerful, occurred without forensic structure. No baseline questions, no behavioral observation protocol, no ability to test consistency or probe contradictions. The later police interviews occurred with forensic structure, but without emotional accessibility. The Ramseys were defended, legally counseled, temporally distant from the event. Forensically, this pattern prevents the kind of holistic assessment that helps distinguish genuine grief from performed grief. Whether this prevention resulted from trauma-driven self-protection or strategic impression management, the forensic effect was to make reliable assessment impossible. Anthropologically, the Ramseys' approach to public grief reflects deep cultural patterns in American celebrity and media culture. In their social and cultural context, appearing on national television to proclaim innocence and display suffering wasn't unusual. It was increasingly standard practice for high-profile cases in the 1990s. Anthropologically, they were following a cultural script for crisis management that their socioeconomic position made available to them. This cultural context matters because what appears calculated or manipulative to observers outside that cultural framework might have felt natural and necessary to the Ramseys. They inhabited a world where media management was normal, where controlling public narrative was expected, where emotional display in controlled settings was how one demonstrated legitimacy. Understanding this anthropological dimension doesn't resolve whether their grief was genuine, but it does contextualize their choices within cultural norms rather than treating those choices as inherently suspicious. However, anthropology also reveals that this cultural script, grieve publicly, defend privately, serves strategic functions that benefit guilty and innocent parties differently, making cultural explanation insufficient for resolving underlying questions of truth. Through the criminal mindset lens, we must examine what public grief performance accomplishes for someone potentially managing guilt and fear of exposure. A perpetrator needs to establish victim status, generate sympathy, and create emotional barriers to accusation. Public grief performance accomplishes all of these objectives brilliantly. It positions the perpetrator as fellow victim, making accusation feel like compounding their suffering. It generates public sympathy that translates into social pressure on investigators to back off. It creates an emotional impression so powerful that evidence to the contrary requires extraordinary cognitive effort to accept. People don't want to believe that someone displaying such visible anguish could be responsible. Criminal psychology recognizes this as effective manipulation, using emotional display to shape others' perceptions and conclusions. The Ramsey's CNN appearance, whether genuinely motivated or strategically calculated, had exactly this effect. It created a powerful emotional impression of devastated parents that portions of the public never move beyond, regardless of subsequent evidence. However, innocent people who feel unjustly accused also have powerful motivations to publicly display their grief, to prove their humanity, to remind skeptics that they're suffering, to create public pressure on investigators to pursue real perpetrators rather than innocent parents. The behavioral pattern serves both possibilities with equal facility. What deeply disturbs me about analyzing grief in this way is how it reveals the potential corruption of our most fundamental human emotions. If we cannot trust grief, if we must evaluate it for authenticity and strategic deployment, then we've entered a realm where human connection becomes impossible and suspicion becomes total. Yet the alternative, accepting all grief performance as genuine, creates vulnerability to manipulation by those who understand that emotion is power. The Ramseys' grief might have been the most genuine thing in the world, the truest expression of their devastation. Or it might have been the most calculated performance available to people who understood that displayed suffering creates protective sympathy. I cannot determine which, and perhaps that uncertainty is the point. By performing grief in controlled contexts while remaining defended in investigative contexts, they created a situation where genuine emotion and strategic emotion became indistinguishable. This ambiguity might have emerged from innocent trauma driven compartmentalization, or it might have been precisely the ambiguity that someone managing guilt would need to create. Either way, it served to ensure that their emotional presentation could never definitively confirm or refute their proclaimed innocence, leaving us perpetually unsure whether we witnessed authentic suffering or masterful theater. Theme 3: The Legal Fortress and the Moral Void. Now we need to address something that makes many people deeply uncomfortable: the relationship between legal rights and moral obligations, and what happens when the two diverge dramatically. From a logical standpoint, there is no inherent contradiction between exercising legal rights and being innocent. Innocent people have every reason to protect themselves from investigative overreach, false confession pressure, and procedural violations. The Ramseys hired attorneys immediately, controlled interview conditions meticulously, and exercised their constitutional rights fully. Logically, this is smart legal strategy regardless of underlying guilt or innocence. However, logic also recognizes that these same protective strategies create barriers to truth discovery that serve guilty parties' interests in avoiding exposure. The logical tension isn't between rights and guilt, it's between individual protection and collective truth seeking. A society that protects individual rights must accept that sometimes those rights prevent truth from emerging. The question becomes whether the Ramsey's exercise of rights falls within normal defensive protection or whether it crossed into aggressive obstruction disguised as constitutional prerogative. Philosophically, we're confronting one of the deepest tensions in liberal legal philosophy: the relationship between rights and responsibilities, between what we're permitted to do and what we're obligated to do. The Ramseys had every legal right to refuse immediate questioning, to demand attorney presence, to control testimony conditions. But did they have a moral obligation to cooperate more fully, given that their daughter's case remained unsolved? Kant's categorical imperative asks what would happen if everyone acted as you do, if every parent who lost a child to violence exercised their rights as fully as the Ramseys did, would justice systems collapse into dysfunction? Utilitarian philosophy asks whether the Ramseys' exercise of rights produced the greatest good. Did their self protection serve larger justice interests or undermine them? Virtue ethics asks whether their conduct reflected the character virtues we associate with innocent grieving parents: transparency, cooperation, prioritization of truth over self protection. These philosophical frameworks don't yield simple answers, but they reveal that legal permission and moral justification operate in different domains that don't always align. The psychological function of legal representation in trauma cases reveals complex dynamics that complicate our moral evaluation. Psychologically, attorneys serve crucial protective functions for traumatized clients. They provide external ego strength when the client's own capacity for rational decision making is compromised. They prevent trauma driven mistakes like false confessions, inappropriate disclosures, or emotional breakdowns that get misinterpreted as deception. They create psychological safety that allows clients to engage with investigation from a position of some stability rather than complete vulnerability. For innocent, traumatized people, legal representation isn't manipulation, it's necessary support. However, psychology also recognizes that legal representation can enable psychological processes that serve guilt. Attorneys help clients construct narratives, identify weaknesses in their accounts, develop responses that minimize exposure. They create psychological distance between the client and the investigation that reduces the emotional pressure that might otherwise lead to confession or revelation. The psychological reality is that legal representation serves both trauma recovery and guilt management, making it impossible to determine which function predominated in the Ramsey case based solely on their decision to lawyer up aggressively. Physiologically, the presence of legal counsel during questioning changes the body's stress response in ways that affect behavioral presentation and observational forensics. When subjects are questioned alone, their physiological stress response, elevated heart rate, cortisol, microexpressions of fear or deception, provides behavioral data that investigators can observe and analyze. When attorneys are present, subjects typically experience reduced physiological stress because they know they have protection and can defer to counsel if questions become uncomfortable. This reduced stress can manifest as increased composure, more measured responses, less behavioral leakage, all of which makes deception detection more difficult. The Ramseys' insistence on attorney presence during all questioning wasn't just legal strategy, it was physiological management. Their bodies could remain calmer, their presentations more controlled, their behavioral patterns less revealing. This serves innocent people by preventing stress-induced behaviors that get misinterpreted as deception. It serves guilty people by preventing stress-induced behaviors that actually indicate deception. The physiological effect is identical regardless of underlying truth. From a forensic criminology perspective, the Ramsey's legal fortress strategy represents one of the most comprehensive defensive operations in modern criminal investigation history. Forensically, they didn't just exercise their rights, they maximized every possible legal protection while maintaining public claims of cooperation. They hired not just defense attorneys, but also criminal forensic experts, handwriting analysts, and media consultants. They controlled what evidence could be accessed, when interviews occurred, what questions could be asked, and in what order. They gave media interviews that created sympathetic narratives while refusing investigative interviews that would test those narratives. Forensically, this created a one-way information flow. The Ramseys could make public claims and accusations, but investigators couldn't effectively challenge or investigate those claims. This is sophisticated forensic defense strategy that's entirely legal but creates nearly insurmountable investigative barriers. The forensic question is whether this level of defensive mobilization reflects innocent people protecting themselves from injustice or guilty people preventing justice from reaching conclusions. Both possibilities require exactly this kind of comprehensive defense, making the strategy itself ambiguous. Anthropologically, the Ramseys' ability to construct and maintain this legal fortress for decades reveals structural inequalities in how justice operates across social classes. The resources required to hire multiple attorneys, forensic experts, media consultants, and private investigators are available only to the wealthy. Anthropologically, this means that justice outcomes correlate with economic resources in ways that undermine claims of equal protection under law. The Ramseys' legal strategy wasn't available to 99% of suspects. It was a privilege of their economic position. This anthropological reality doesn't tell us whether they needed this protection or exploited it, but it does reveal that the investigation proceeded according to rules that their wealth allowed them to impose. Lower income suspects facing identical evidence would likely have been prosecuted because they couldn't afford the defensive architecture that kept the Ramseys uncharged. Understanding this anthropological dimension reveals that the case outcome might have depended as much on structural privilege as on factual guilt or innocence, a deeply troubling possibility that indicts the justice system itself. Through the criminal mindset lens, we must examine what comprehensive legal defense accomplishes for someone potentially responsible for harm and managing fear of exposure. A perpetrator needs several things: control over information flow, protection from spontaneous confession during weak moments, expert analysis of evidence that might identify defensive strategies, public narrative management that maintains community support. The Ramseys' legal fortress provided all of these protective functions. Their attorneys could preview evidence, identify prosecution theories, craft responses that addressed every vulnerability without creating new ones. They could prevent the kind of prolonged, psychologically pressured questioning that sometimes breaks through denial and produces confession. They could ensure that no statement was ever made without careful legal vetting that minimized exposure risk. Criminal psychology recognizes this as comprehensive defensive insulation, creating layers of protection so complete that even if guilt exists, the psychological and legal barriers to its revelation become insurmountable. However, trauma psychology recognizes that innocent people who feel targeted also seek comprehensive protection. They want experts who can identify investigative bias, attorneys who can prevent rights violations, consultants who can ensure their truth is heard correctly. The defensive architecture serves both possibilities with equal efficacy. What deeply troubles me about this entire dimension is how it reveals a potential void at the heart of our justice system, a space where legal rights and moral obligations diverge so completely that justice becomes impossible. The Ramseys did everything they were legally entitled to do. They hired attorneys, controlled testimony, exercised their rights fully. If they're innocent, this was necessary protection against investigative railroading. If they're guilty, this was successful justice evasion through legal means. The system cannot distinguish between these possibilities because the behaviors are identical. This creates a moral paradox where doing what you have every right to do might still constitute injustice if those rights are used to prevent truth rather than protect it. I cannot determine which function the Ramseys' legal fortress served, but I can observe that the effect was identical regardless, a case that cannot be prosecuted, not necessarily because the evidence doesn't point toward family involvement, but because the defensive architecture made that evidence legally unreachable. This might represent the successful protection of innocent people from state power, or it might represent the successful exploitation of legal protections by those with resources to deploy them comprehensively. The ambiguity is either the price we pay for liberty or the loophole through which justice fails. Perhaps it's both. We've journeyed through temporal manipulation, performative grief, and legal fortresses, examining how time, emotion, and rights can become tools that either protect innocence or obscure guilt with equal facility. Part 3 reveals the ultimate sophistication in defensive strategy, not just responding to investigation, but controlling every dimension of it through resources, timing, and legal architecture. Next time, we'll synthesize everything we've explored across all three parts, examining what the complete pattern tells us about truth, certainty, and whether justice is even possible when defensive strategies become this comprehensive. The questions grow harder, the answers more elusive, but the pursuit matters. Until then,